Well, Trump 2.0 was never going to be for those of a nervous disposition or for folks who have trouble keeping up, and so it has proved. Those coming along for the ride must have guessed that they were jumping on a roller coaster. If not, they'll realise that now. Everything is happening at a dizzying pace. No sooner were we getting used to the idea of 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican exports to America than the whole shebang was paused for 30 days, because both countries made concessions Donald Trump liked. The President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada agreed to deploy an extra 10,000 troops each on their borders with America to disrupt the flow of illegal migrants and drugs into the USA. Whether it will make much of a difference is another matter. Since the Mexican border accounts for over 96% of the illegal drugs entering America and 99% of the illegal immigrants, those newly deployed Canadian troops could be sitting on their hands. No matter, Trump liked the idea of Canada kowtowing to him. Frazzled stock markets, which had plunged on news of the Trump tariffs, started to recover. That plunge may have influenced Trump. The US stock market is an important metric for him as a measure of his success or failure. But the markets might be about to get frazzled again. Trump's 10% tariffs on Chinese exports to America came into force today, and China has already retaliated with 10 to 15% tariffs of its own on various imports from America, including oil and natural gas. And the European Union is still in the frame. Trump has described its treatment of America as a, quote, atrocity, by which he means the US buys more from the EU than vice versa. The EU is bracing itself for at least 10% tariffs by the weekend and, of course, has retaliatory measures ready to go. As for Britain, the policy of the Starmer government is simply to keep its head down and hope Trump won't notice us. Starmer and his ministers are still in full oleaginous charm offensive mode with Trump, hoping relentless flattery will avoid an Anglo-American trade war. It's not a pretty sight. Starmer refuses to criticise Trump's use of tariffs to force his will on other countries and has markedly avoided any words of solidarity with the EU, which might be wise, but it's also a problem when you're trying to cozy up closer to the EU and pose as a good European, as Starmer is. Last night, he was at the EU summit dinner in Brussels as part of a mission to get back inside the EU tent without actually rejoining the EU. The Trump tariff wars could not be a worse backdrop for this Starmer strategy. Not surprisingly, the Europeans would like to think they could count on British support in any trade war with America, especially if Britain wants to be their new best friends again. But Starmer says he doesn't need to pick sides. Fair enough. But if he wants either a full-blooded new trade deal with America, or to align more closely with single market rules to boost trade with the EU, then he might have to choose. For it's looking pretty certain he can't have both. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio. Let's look at all that with Jerry Baker, Times columnist, editor-at-large on the Wall Street Journal. He joins us from the United States now. Jerry, good morning your time to you.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Did Mr. Trump, did he get real concessions out of Mexico and Canada, or did he in effect blink?
He blinked. Let's be honest. Donald Trump went into this saying that tariffs are an intrinsically good thing. He's makes fun of himself to some extent by saying things like, tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. But there's some underlying reality to that. With Donald Trump, you never quite know what he believes. But on tariffs, he's been clear about tariffs for 40 years. He used to rail about the trade deficit with Japan back in the 1980s when it mattered.
Indeed.
So he has been consistent on tariffs, and he believes that tariffs are a good thing for the US. He wants to kind of reorient US taxation so that less of it comes from income tax and corporate tax and more of it comes from tariffs. He believes that protecting American industry is intrinsically a good thing against countries that run deficits. So this was the backdrop. This was what he was saying about the imposition of tariffs. On top of that, he was demanding, of course, that Canada and Mexico do more to stop the illegal flow of drugs and the illegal flow of human beings across their border. As you rightly said in your introduction, Andrew, the vast majority of that, the vast majority comes from Mexico, not from Canada. It's not completely clear what he really wanted Canada to do. So that was the backdrop. He basically said, we're going to impose these tariffs, which are a good thing, and I'm going to do it. And unless Mexico and Canada take some drastic action to stop the flow of illegal migrants, I'm going to impose them. Well, the deal, at least the temporary deal that's come up with, is essentially meaningless. It's they're, as you said, they're going to send. Both Mexico's going to supposedly send 10,000 troops to the border. Well, they've done that in the past without the threat of sanctions. As it happens, the number of illegal migrants coming across the border from Mexico is slowing sharply. Canada has never had that problem. Canada's concessions that it announced yesterday included doing basically everything it said it was going to do back last year when it announced plans to tighten its border. So, look, Trump has blinked here. There's no question about that. They're dressing it up as a diplomatic victory for him, but he's essentially obtained nothing, and he has suspended these tariffs.
Now, he slapped only 10% tariffs on China, and the Chinese retaliation with their tariffs, I would suggest, has been relatively muted, and they don't come in until Monday of next week. Should we therefore expect some kind of interim deal be done there too?
Yeah, it's quite possible. I think again, Trump, Trump imposed tariffs on China in his first term, and that was primarily about China's enormous trade surplus with the US. A lot of it obviously was about technology and concerns that China's long been stealing US technology. Those tariffs were imposed. Interestingly, they were maintained in place by President Biden. Now, they still are, and indeed they're still in place. With these latest tariffs, again, Trump again has talked about the fentanyl threat, because a lot of the fentanyl that comes through Mexico does originate in China. And again, he's talked about the importance of, evening out, balancing the US trade deficit. But we can probably, again, as you said, China's given a few days before they impose their tariffs. The U.S. tariffs on China did, in fact, come into effect today. And look, I think despite what he said about how wonderful tariffs are, Donald Trump knows that tariffs are a lose-lose proposition. That you impose tariffs on another country, it hurts them for sure, but it hurts you. It's like shooting yourself in the foot, because of course it puts additional costs on your consumers. It raises prices here. It interrupts the ability of manufacturers here to get some of their goods, or they have to pay more for some of their parts. Nobody thinks really tariffs are a very good idea, and I think a lot of this with Trump, as with so much of what he does, Andrew, is performative, right? It's storytelling. It's, we've got a grievance, we've been treated badly by these other countries, I'm going to show them, I'm going to demonstrate that America doesn't take this lying down, they're going to make concessions, and we're going to win. And I think that's really what this almost entire performance is about.
And what about the European Union? Is it still expected he'll levy tariffs on the EU? I mean, we know he doesn't really he kind of viscerally dislikes the EU. He's described its trade policy towards the US as, quote, an atrocity. So should they be braced now for Trump tariffs?
Yeah, I do think the EU is slightly different. I mean, you're absolutely right. Yeah, there is no affection in Donald Trump's breast for the EU, of its institutions, or most of its leaders. We may see what happens when Germany gets a new chancellor, presumably later this month. But he's no fan of the EU. It is also true that the EU actually does have some protectionist measures in place to protect some of its own sectors, which the US doesn't. So there is some genuine cause there, if you like, for the US to actually say, well, we need to to redress that. And the US and the EU does run a very, very large surplus with the United States. Yes. So I think with the EU, and then remember, there are other things he wants from the EU or many EU countries, like more spending on NATO defense. He wants less regulation of things like AI, which I think he thinks American companies are being hit hard by some of the tech regulation. So there are more specific things unrelated to drugs and illegal migration that the EU are doing, that he actually may think that tariffs are a good form of leverage to actually force them to change.
Interesting. Now, what about Britain then? Obviously not in the EU. The Starmer government is sticking to its charm offensive with Mr. Trump. It hopes not to be lumped in with Europe. Is this wise? Because I tell you, it's not a pretty sight watching some of this charm offensive, because we know what they used to say about Mr. Trump. Is that wise, or will Mr. Trump just see it as a sign of weakness?
Yeah, David Lammy and Keir Starmer are going to discover what a toxic narcissist can, well, how friendly and good news a toxic narcissist can really be for Britain. Yeah, I think it probably is. Look, you're absolutely right. You drew attention to those remarks he made the other night, where he talks about Britain has a real problem, but I'm talking to the British about that, and I think we can solve it. And then he described what the EU's doing on trade as an atrocity. You're absolutely right. He has a kind of, definitely has an affection for the UK. His mother obviously was Scottish, Andrew, as you well know. He does love the royal family. There's a lot of golf courses in the UK which he doesn't, where he's played, and he doesn't have the same in Europe. So look, I mean, I'm not trivializing slightly, but yeah. And by the way, most important of all, let me say this: of the 10 countries that the United States trades most with, the UK is the only country with which the US has a surplus. The US actually has a trading surplus. So all the grounds that Trump may have, almost all the grounds for saying, the UK, for treating the UK in the same way as the EU, are not there. The UK is in a very different category. So yeah, I think the charm offensive is probably wise. Trump is very forgiving about some of the things that people have said about him in the past. And as I say, he also would love to be able to do anything that he might think demonstrates that Brexit was a great idea. He's a big, keen supporter of Brexit. So if Britain somehow gets some sort of special treatment outside the EU, which enables people who supported Brexit to say, haha, look, we're better off than the EU because we're outside the EU and Trump's treating us better, I think he will be inclined to do it.
Can we knock on the head, though, because Labour spin doctors in London are putting the idea around that Starmer is the Trump whisperer. Not quite sure what it means, but I just feel we should knock that on the head right away.
Yeah, I think you're right, Andrew. I mean, Nigel Farage, I mean, whether you like him or not, Nigel Farage is a Trump whisperer. To some extent, I mean, Farage, I don't think Farage could persuade Trump to impose tariffs on the UK, and I think it'd be very unwise to try and do so. But Farage is much closer. Look, Trump has no particular enthusiasm for Keir Starmer. They have no political kind of convergence or affiliation whatsoever. It is, if Trump does exempt Britain from this sort of trade war, then it will be to do with the things to do with the United Kingdom as a nation and nothing to do with the occupant of number 10.
Now, Jerry, before we let you go, and we're grateful for your time, the White House is now getting a hold of what the USAID department, it looks like it may be closing down, the International Aid Department, some of the things it's been spending American tax dollars on. This is the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt.
Here's the reason why Elon Musk and others have been taking a look, because if you look at the waste and abuse that has run through USAID over the past several years, these are some of the insane priorities that organization has been spending money on. $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces, $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. I don't know about you, but as an American taxpayer, I don't want my dollars going towards this crap.
Jerry, I think they're still enjoying themselves in the early days of power, aren't they?
Probably enjoying themselves more than the audience at that transgender opera at Columbia.
I can't wait to see it myself.
Or the one that, that supposedly took place in Ireland. Look, I mean, there's a lot of wasteful and sort of ideologically oriented spending, particularly in the last few years. You have to be a little bit careful about some of these claims before I'd like to see them verified. We had a claim last week that the US was spending tens of $millions on condoms. And
that turned out to be untrue.
For Gaza, which actually turned out to be condoms for Southern Africa under the PEPFAR program, which has been an incredibly beneficial program introduced by George W. Bush 20 years ago to help deal with AIDS and eliminate AIDS, actually, in Southern Africa. So, I want to be a bit careful before some of these, before we cast judgment on some of these supposed lunatic ideas. But there's no question. Look, aid. There's no question that there has been, waste, but also projects that I'm sure most Americans would be horrified by. The larger question, though, about aid is, and this is the point, I think, as you said, that it's not completely clear yet whether Trump is closing that down, the USAID, or folding it into the State Department, which seems likely, is as in many countries in the last few years, there's been a realization that aid probably needs to be used more effectively as a tool of foreign policy. And so if you make it subordinate to the State Department, which runs foreign policy, then I think programs like PEPFAR, as I say, which which is the AIDS relief program in Africa, which has been extremely beneficial. But it's also has done, has been beneficial, obviously, first and foremost in itself, and a virtue in itself. It's obviously done wonders for the U.S. For if you like, for U.S. soft power and the power of U.S. diplomacy. That the U.S. has brought so much relief to such a benighted part of the world. So they'll want to continue to do things like that. But yeah, I'm sorry, if you were planning to see that transgender play in Ireland at any point, Andrew, in the next 4 years, then I think you probably better go elsewhere.
Well, and I've already booked my flight. Never mind, Jerry. Thanks for joining us. And you can read Jerry's excellent columns in The Times and The Wall Street Journal.